Welcome to Epg Pathshala. My name is Purendra Prasad. I am professor in the Department of Sociology. Today we are going to talk about the last module. This is the summary of the conceptual and substantive issues in Sociology of Health course. This module provides a summary of all the 34 modules in Sociology of Health, which is presented in terms of 12 themes. The purpose of this module is to provide a clarity to the students why sociology of health actually is important in terms of understanding the basics, and also how do we actually understand the empirical issues in the Indian society through a particular kind of conceptual framework. Okay, so this particular module provides the comprehensive kind of a summary of the modules. To start with, the first module actually begins with the basic concepts in sociology of health. What are the basic concepts? Concepts like health, ill health, sickness, disease. These concepts actually appear as though they are all commonsensical. Everyone knows about it, and what is there to actually understand? The way health actually is defined by, say for instance, today widely accepted definition by the WHO, World Health Organization, where it talks about not simply in terms of physical, so psychological, but also the social dimensions. Okay, apart from that kind of a definition of World Health Organization, the way health actually is defined today in terms of normality, order. Okay, sociologically, it's important to define how these concepts actually evolved. For instance, health, ill health actually are not mutually kind of antagonistic categories. The once you are actually healthy, you can't be ill health. No, I may be having arthritis, but I'm perfectly well. So health and ill health are also mutually coexisting categories. But we need to understand that every human being in this society, as Susan Sontag actually says, lives in the kingdom of wellness and in the kingdom of illness. So both actually is something that are common, but it's not that we actually leave one kingdom and move to another kingdom. No. So the conceptual kind of a clarity in terms of how health is defined, how ill health is defined, how disease actually, which is defined more in terms of biomedical kind of a category as a physical and anatomical abnormality. While I think sociologists talk about physical abnormalities or physical disorders may exist, what actually also contributes to are certain social dimensions, and therefore how concept like sickness that Alan Young and others actually talk about explains the movement from physiological to psychological to worrisome behavior to the conditions of poverty, inequality, and the whole range of social political conditions which actually contribute to sickness. So these conceptual kind of definitions, actually the disease, sickness, illness, are something that have been introduced in the first kind of unit. It also talks about the concepts like ability and disability, who are able and who are disabled. how are certain categories of people actually labeled as disabled? Simply because they are not able to perform certain expected roles in society. So what if they are able to perform these roles in a different way? So how are these concepts actually coming into the usage? So this kind of disability kind of a discourse actually introduces questioning the way concepts are actually imposed. Normality is imposed actually to define some people as abnormal and deviant and mad and insane and sexually different, and whole range of these categories. So I think at different points of time, these subjective notions of classifying deviants and differently abled people actually has been questioned, and therefore I think these concepts are introduced in the first unit. The second unit talks about structures of ill health. Basically, this unit introduces different modules explaining how poverty, inequality significantly contribute to ill health. So, if one needs to understand how diseases or illnesses are produced, it's important to understand conditions of living. What does that mean? It means that one needs to understand the social, economic, and political conditions prevailing in each society to actually explain how inequalities actually have been produced and how inequality is closely correlated with the production of diseases and illnesses. A lot of examples, I think today if you look at malaria or tuberculosis or a lot of these respiratory and infectious diseases actually are produced in the lower kind of classes and poorer kind of socioeconomic backgrounds. Okay, today in India, people actually die, most of them of malaria and tuberculosis, the tropical disease, not of HIV/AIDS. Okay, and both these malaria and tuberculosis actually are produced in the lower kind of socioeconomic conditions. So these structures of ill health actually provides the correlation between these factors. In fact, one of the module in this unit actually is Rakku's story. Rakku, an agricultural Dalit woman in Tamil Nadu, her own kind of a story, which is come out in a book, is presented to explain the conditions of the poverty, agricultural laboring kind of population and their kind of compulsions of work, compulsions of family, and how women actually are forced to bear the burden or triple burden of the work, uh, uh, managing the children, and also in terms of the household kind of chores. Okay, so Rakku's story where she actually takes her child, sick child, to a nearby urban center, and her own kind of dilemmas and predicaments in terms of negotiating with the public healthcare system, and how she becomes actually completely helpless, where her child actually was not treated by the doctors because she actually did not have ability to actually explain, or her turn actually was it comes very late in the time where her child actually dies of diarrhea, and the entire narrative explains how inequality actually is closely interlinked with the infections and the diseases and death, etc. So structures of ill health actually is a very important kind of a unit that links between the basic concepts and to that of the social, economic, and political conditions that produce the risk, disease, etc. And then when we move to third unit, that is actually public health in colonial and post-independent India. In this unit, actually, the modules talk about development of medicine in colonial India, starting with David Arnold's Colonizing the Body, where both David Arnold, Mark Harrison explain the way interaction between Western system of knowledge and Indian system of knowledge actually has taken place, how bodies were colonized by the Western medicine to gain the supremacy over the Indian kind of culture and Indian bodies. Okay, so I think these modules actually help us explain the coexistence of allopathic and the Indian systems of medicine for a period of time, and then the dominance of the allopathic medicine over a period of time, and later on in post-independent India, how this medical knowledge system actually, the allopathic medical knowledge system, becomes the mainstay for the Indian healthcare kind of design. So, when you look at the post-independent India, how public healthcare actually was developed, two important kind of developments were described in this unit. One, Sir John Boer Committee that was constituted in 1946, much before the British actually left India. The report actually provided the basis for establishing the Indian system of medicine, which is completely based on the allopathic knowledge system. But the Boer Committee also very categorically laid the norms of actually establishing the healthcare system in every nook and corner of the country, because it recognized that there are huge disparities between rural and urban areas. And therefore, this particular kind of a module narrates how, first 2 decades of post-independent India actually were seen as the golden kind of age of the public health system in India. And then from the late 60s onwards, with the establishment of different committees by the government of India, starting from Mudaliar committee to other kind of committees, introduced the private kind of healthcare. So what was an obligation of the state to provide health care to every citizen at their doorstep? Now the privatization of health services actually was gradually introduced, and by 70s the deeper entrenchment of the idea of private and the nursing homes and other systems of private healthcare came in. So that whole narrative actually is described, and the way primary healthcare actually as a concept came in India, saying that it's important to address the basic and the primary healthcare, and only then the secondary and tertiary healthcare actually can be built on. So how the referral system was developed, the evolution of these entire healthcare models actually happened, was all narrated in this unit 3. And moving to the unit 4, where the privatization of health services in India actually took off. And here I think different modules actually bring in 2 elements. One, a large scale privatization of healthcare in terms of not simply the nursing homes and the kind of medium level hospitals, but later on certain corporate hospitals and the establishment of different norms and ethics that actually guided the delivery of healthcare systems. So, on one hand, this unit actually traces the entire trajectory of development of private healthcare services in India, um, till the kind of globalization and the way Indian state actually provided a lot of support to private healthcare models, starting with Apollo Pratap Reddy actually establishing his kind of a hospitals, and later how that kind of patronage led to establishment of the Apollo model of private healthcare, which is today actually one of the largest kind of private healthcare models in South Asia. Okay, so that entire trajectory is provided in this unit. At second level, I think the rural private practitioners, meaning that there are non-qualified or unqualified rural private practitioners who are practicing in rural India. Okay, so while the qualified medical practitioners of allopathy, Ayurveda, and Unani actually are all located in the urban centers, the non-qualified and the kind of self-trained doctors actually are all practicing in rural India. So the dynamics of these rural private practitioners, why are they popular? How did they become actually doctors? And what is the validity of their kind of medical practice in each of their contexts? And how Rode and Vishwanathan and other researchers argue that it's important to recognize these rural private practitioners, bring them to the mainstream, and actually incorporate them into the healthcare kind of system, so that there can be a database of the diseases that can be built, there can be accountability that can be built, there can be training that can be built, there can be huge kind of collaborative network between qualified and non-qualified practitioners can be built, because in India, non-qualified practitioners seem to be the mainstay in rural India. So that whole dynamics is presented in that unit 4. Unit 5 talks about health policies and specific disease programs in India. It begins with the health policies, the way Bohr, Sir John Bohr Committee actually provided the basis for the health design, to that of 1983 National Health Policy, how that actually advocated strengthening of the public healthcare system, including the alternative kind of knowledge systems, integrate some of these systems, and this was largely influenced by the Alma Ata 1978 declaration, Health for All by 2000. So the 83 National Health Policy actually is brought in to understand the compulsions of the state to actually incorporate the other systems of knowledge, etc. And then, of course, the the newer health policies in India, whether it is Health Policy 2001 and Health Policy 2015 that recently Government of India has come up with, and of course some of the working groups like high level expert group that was constituted in 2008. So how these health policies in India actually were very radical in their kind of formulation and in their kind of proclamations, but none of these documents actually provided the basis for implementing or designing the healthcare programs. So these modules actually tell us Indian healthcare system has been vertically designed, centrally planned, it's largely imposed from above, while the kind of states actually were only implementing agencies. To give or to substantiate these points, specific disease programs were actually elaborated in modules. For instance, I think how malaria program in India actually emerged and what are its implications. For instance, in that module, uh, how national malaria control program that actually was developed in 1960s, uh, the government of India actually was very hopeful that they will be able to eliminate or eradicate malaria altogether, and therefore they moved from national malaria control program to national malaria eradication program. uh, but then the whole program actually collapsed because of the political and economic factors, where the DDT spray that was one of the important kind of anti-malarial kind of sprays uh, did not actually the supplies of this DDT fell short. Government of India did not have those resources because of the world wars and certain kind of conflict between India and other nations. How United States of America imposed certain conditionalities that curtailed the supplies of DDT, that actually did not eradicate, did not control. But today, World Bank and other programs actually have come back saying that we only can think of national anti-malaria program, meaning that we can't control, we can't eradicate, but we can only have anti-malaria programs. So that whole politics of malaria is presented in these modules to explain how the scientific and technological kind of fixes, okay, are mediated by the economic and political factors. That's one. Second, some of the solutions that are provided in terms of malaria, in terms of insecticide treatment, in terms of the mosquito nets program and early detection and preventive programs, all these programs had limitations because the communities actually did not have basic kind of resources. When mosquito nets were provided to some of these communities, they used as fishing nets. Some of them used it for as their house kind of a door kind of a thing. Okay, so I think a lot of these programs actually collapsed because the health policies did not take into account the living conditions of these communities, and hence today malaria actually is one of the important kind of a disease that's affecting not only mortality but also morbidity. Similarly, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, and cholera and other disease programs actually are presented to substantiate how health policies actually had limitations in its kind of approach. Then moving on to the next unit called the pharmaceuticals in third world context. What is the meaning of drug? How medicines actually are perceived? Why there is actually reluctance in terms of using certain drugs by the local communities? I think this unit actually comes up with a lot of these the kind of narratives. Basically, I think it starts with you know uh, the way the pharmaceutical policy actually is formulated in India. In this unit, starting from how Hathi Committee recommendations actually provided a very key kind of a contribution in regulating the multinational and transnational kind of pharmaceutical companies in terms of ethics, in terms of spurious and other kind of standard and quality kind of drug production in India. From there, I think this unit also deals with the social cultural perceptions of medicines in third world context. Why is it that some of these local communities perceive some of these medicines actually as very strong, high dose, and if they consume these medicines, actually they need to eat actually a good food, and therefore they actually curtail the use of medicines. Okay, so the cultural notions of these medications and medicines actually is also brought in to give an overview to the students how pharmaceuticals actually need to be understood, and these are actually useful in terms of analyzing the social and other kind of consequences. Moving to the other unit called regulatory and ethical issues in health, which is very closely linked to the earlier unit of medicines and drugs. Particularly in this unit, actually, clinical trials is brought in. Surrogacy, euthanasia, and other kind of dimensions are brought in, saying that in the name of actually doing research and doing clinical trials in third world countries like India, how some of these multinational companies actually are using the Indian population as guinea pigs, or not actually complying with the ethical and other kind of standards in India, and the dynamics in terms of clinical trials itself, how clinical trial industry actually is operating, the way healthy volunteers are coerced into the cheap labor force to submit their bodies to the clinical trials, or how the hospitals actually are becoming sites because doctors who are perceived as gods and demigods in India do not even actually question why they are being actually drawn into the clinical trials, participating without actually knowing what their bodies are being subjected to. So whole new dynamics of regulatory and ethical dimensions are actually presented in this unit. And moving to the next unit, issues of equity, where on the one hand, government of India is committed to providing equitable kind of a access to healthcare for all citizens. Okay, so that is something starting from Bore Committee to the latest kind of National Health Policy 2015. Okay, while there is a commitment that it is going to provide equitable access and equitable utilization of health services, but the way a lot of public private partnership is brought in, outsourcing is brought in, contractualization is brought in, how these actually are alienating the people from utilization of health resources. So health equity is actually brought in this unit to explain, how healthcare policies and other set of things are actually, playing out. And then, having actually explained empirically from concepts to certain specific disease program to pharmaceuticals and equity issues and regulatory issues, we now bring in the theories, the theoretical concepts, and how theoretical concepts in sociology help explain these dynamics. These theoretical concepts actually, in terms of whether it is mind-body dualism, embodiment, and whole range of gendered body and whole range of concepts actually are brought in here to explain how health policies and substantive kind of issues are actually are to be analyzed. Okay, so the conceptual kind of clarity is brought in not only from the sociological kind of frameworks, but also from the feminist theory, from the postmodernist, from subaltern, and whole range of things. So what these units actually talk about is, the functionalist perspectives, the Marxist perspectives, postmodernist perspective, subaltern perspectives, and in terms of certain kind of marginality and ethno-medical kind of perspectives. So a whole range of conceptual kind of tools and explanatory frames are provided, so that it provides the basis for students in sociology to actually engage. Okay, so in that sense, we actually move into the next unit talking about different systems of medicine. Okay, how allopathy actually emerged, and what is the epistemology and dynamics of allopathy and that of alternative systems of medicine. In fact, this unit, allopathic medical knowledge system, actually emerged in Europe, particularly after Industrial Revolution. One of the fundamental questions that this particular unit raises is that when there were several hundreds and thousands of years actually ancient medical knowledge developed in Egypt, in China, in India, in Turkey, in Persia, and whole range of things. Why is it that modern medical knowledge actually developed in Europe? What happened to these, the rich ancient kind of medical knowledge systems? So here, the explanation was that it is closely tied to the development of capital. The way modern medicine developed, the way biological sciences and physics and a whole range of modern sciences actually developed in Europe was due to the whole range of theoretical and scientific kind of revolutions that happened. If you look after the Industrial Revolution, range of scientific innovations and philosophies and whole range of things actually developed in Europe. By way of introducing to the students how allopathic or modern medicine actually evolved, developed, and how it became dominant, and what is its philosophy, what is its epistemology, this unit also brings in the alternative systems of medicine like Ayurveda, Unani, homeopathy, Siddha medicine, and the ethnomedicine, and how these systems actually also had its own epistemology, theories, concepts, and frameworks. So this unit provides a comprehensive kind of thing in terms of development of medical knowledge systems across the world, and with an emphasis in terms of understanding how they emanated and evolved in the Indian context, particularly in post-independent India, after globalization, how commercialization actually influenced these processes. I think this is the emphasis of these unit. And finally, I think the last section actually concludes saying that the concepts of health and illness, ability, disability, pain and suffering, religion, morality, ethics and norms, how these conceptual categories are very important in understanding, explaining health, illness, etc. And the way both the theories, theoretical concepts actually have been introduced to also engage a comparative kind of a perspective in understanding the Indian health care as well as the way world health systems actually emerged. And this is where the sociology of health actually is summarized in this module to provide to the students the significance of understanding the relation between medicine, health, and society. Thank you.